Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Coming up on our program, this week's key political developments, from special counsel Bob Mueller's indictments to the GOP tax reform proposal. Also, as Puerto Rico continues to struggle to recover from Hurricane Maria, we'll talk to two California nurses who traveled there recently to provide aid. But first, a look at the investigation into alleged Russian interference in the 2016 election. This week, Silicon Valley executives testified before Congress about the role their companies played in allowing Russian misinformation to spread in the run-up to the presidential election. The questions revolved around how Russian operatives were able to pose as Americans and spread content through Facebook, Twitter, and Google on divisive issues such as immigration and race relations. Also this week, the first criminal charges stemming from special counsel Bob Mueller's investigation into Russia's role in the election. Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's former campaign chairman, was indicted for tax fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy against the United States. Manafort and his business associate Rick Gates, who was also indicted, surrendered to the authorities on Monday. And for more on all of this, we turn to California Congressman Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. He joins us via Skype from Washington, D.C. Congressman Schiff, nice to have you back on the program.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
You led the hearings this week where executives of Facebook, Google, and Twitter all testified about how their companies were used as tools for a broad Russian misinformation campaign. How would you assess the testimony from those companies?
Well, I think it was very important because the American people got to see for the first time what these ads look like, just how cynical they are, and just how the Russians skillfully use these platforms to propagandize us during the election, but also to just drive wedges between Americans. And indeed, that effort hasn't stopped. It continues in the form of advertising, for example, or promotion or content that the Russians are pushing out on the NFL, for example, the president and instigating the whole kneeling controversy or giving that greater fuel. So it goes on, and I think the tech companies helped us expose that to the American people.
So what steps do you think the companies, Facebook, Google, and Twitter, should take to make sure this doesn't happen again?
Well, they have to be better prepared next time. I think it took them for a long time to realize the Russians were even doing this on their platforms. But now they are forewarned, and they're, I think, developing the mechanisms to try to spot this earlier. We'll also need to develop better cooperation between the intelligence community and the tech companies so that they can be alerted when the intelligence community has identified Russian bad actors that are abusing their platforms. But part of what we're trying to get at is what kind of mechanisms are the companies developing? How confident are they in their forensic capabilities? Do they need to gather more information from their users to prevent this kind of abuse? What about the fact that some of these algorithms themselves may heighten divisions in American society? And what obligation do they have to look at those questions that go well beyond foreign interference?
Did you hear anything at the hearings that would suggest to you that they have the mechanisms and that they have the will to put them in place as well? Because as you know, a lot of these sites, part of their business model is to make things as widespread and viral and addictive as possible.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think that part of the question that we need to answer, and I don't think we got a complete answer during the hearing, is what steps are they going to take, or do they acknowledge the effect of the algorithms? That is, that things that make us angry or fearful tend to take flight. Stories that tend to percolate to the top of our news feeds may include things that are patently false. They're not rising because they're true. They're rising because the algorithms tell them that we'll be interested and spend more time on the platform if we see it.
There have been many developments this week in special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. We have the two indictments against Paul Manafort and Rick Gates, a plea bargain with the former campaign advisor George Papadopoulos, and now President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has been turning over documents to Mr. Mueller as well. What is your reaction to all these developments?
Well, I think they're very significant in different ways. Manafort's allegations are very significant because he was the campaign manager, central player in the campaign, who was, if you believe the indictment, laundering money even during the campaign. And moreover, there are allegations that during the campaign, he was making outreach to the same sources of this laundered money, seeking more of it in exchange for information he was ready to provide about the campaign. Papadopoulos goes directly to the issue of collusion. He also goes to the issue of dishonesty, because we have seen time and time again Trump campaign people and administration officials being less than honest with the public about their contacts with the Russians. And in this case, the Russians made a direct approach to a foreign policy advisor of the campaign, and again made it clear before the country was aware, maybe even before our own agencies were largely appreciative of the fact that the Russians had hacked Democratic computers.
And President Trump and Attorney General Jeff Sessions have said repeatedly they know of no one from the Trump campaign who had contacts with Russians during the election. But court documents released this week show that Papadopoulos had frequent discussions with Russians in 2016. He touted them in front of President Trump and also Mr. Trump and Mr. Sessions back then. How do you interpret all that?
Well, moreover, we had a hearing yesterday with Carter Page, and Carter Page has now acknowledged publicly that he told then Senator Sessions that he was just about to go to Moscow. So it does beg a lot of questions about why there has been so much deception, dissembling, you name it, when it comes to the campaign's contacts with the Russians. But more fundamentally, it just shows the extraordinary degree of connections between a hostile foreign power and a presidential campaign. That has never been the case. And of course, that begs the biggest question of all, which is why? Why were there these intimate connections with the campaign?
Congressman Schiff, House Republicans released their tax plan this week. What is your view of how that plan would affect Californians?
Well, one thing we know for sure, it brings corporate rates down. It also brings rates down for, very, very wealthy families that have large estates like the Trumps. In terms of middle-class families, though, if you're a middle-class family in a state like California, it is likely to give you a very big tax increase because it would limit your mortgage interest deduction. It'll prevent you from deducting your state and local taxes. And so millions of Californians are going to get a whopping tax increase if this becomes law. It will also chill the housing industry. It'll prevent people from deducting student loan interest, so it will hurt students that have borrowed to pay their way through higher education. It's a pretty big loser. We could do a much better bill that simplifies the tax code and provides relief to small businesses. This isn't it. The biggest beneficiaries, quite literally the biggest beneficiaries of this tax bill, will be the Trump family.
All right, well, this is certainly just the first step. I expect there will be much more debate on this tax bill in the months to come. Congressman Adam Schiff, ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And for a reaction now to what we just heard and to broaden the discussion, I'm now joined in studio by Hoover Institution Fellow Lanhee Chen, Politico senior writer Carla Marinucci, and Definer's public affairs partner Tim Miller. Thank you all for being here. Lanhee, we just heard what Congressman Adam Schiff said about the Mueller investigation and what it reveals regarding what he calls an extraordinary degree of connections between the Trump campaign and the Russians. What do you make of his comments?
Well, look, I think that these hearings are critically important because I think that they allow us to see into a period of time and, frankly, a set of interactions that on their face are very troubling. And so I think what we'll learn from these hearings are important. I think Congress is doing its job. I think, by the way, the White House ought to allow these investigations to play out to see what we discover from these things. I thought it was interesting, just the other thing that was discussed in your interview with him, very good interview with him, was this issue of the activity between social media companies and Russia. And there, the interesting thing to me is how policymakers continue to behave like this behavior was totally unexpected, that we didn't know the Russians were interested at all in subverting American democracy. They've been doing this around the world, in Europe particularly, for decades. So I think policymakers need to look at themselves a little bit and have a discussion about what more they could have done in preventing this activity.
Well, neither Manafort nor Gates, going back to the Mueller investigation, have been charged yet with directly engaging the Russians, right, during the 2016 election. Their charges have to do more with money offshore. Papadopoulos, though, was reportedly a low-level advisor in the Trump campaign. What's the strategy here, Carla, behind what Mueller is doing?
Well, I think the Papadopoulos issue is the biggest problem right now for Trump. The idea that this was a coffee boy and a low-level volunteer just doesn't fly in the face of the evidence. He was doing interviews in London, representing himself as a major player in the campaign, being quoted on issues like criticizing David Cameron. Right now, I think the focus is on him and the guilty plea, and I think that's the biggest issue where collusion has the potential to raise its head here.
I would say, though, that you can't underestimate the point of Manafort, and I just want to bring it back to that because the Trump administration's spin is that this had nothing to do with the campaign. But if you look at the fact pattern, Manafort was on the take from Russian oligarchs for years before the campaign started. And then he was hired as campaign chairman. And then the Russians approached Papadopoulos and Don Trump Jr. with these emails, and now Paul Manafort has been indicted. It was known that Paul Manafort was working closely with Russian oligarchs before he took that job. That was not a surprise to anybody. And so I think this is very much related to the campaign. And I don't agree with Adam Schiff very much, but I think that his point about how close all these connections are and how unprecedented it is gets lost a little bit in the political back and forth.
So where does this go from here, Tim? So if you're Jeff Sessions, for example, who's already testified under oath before a Senate committee that there was no contact that he knew of between the Trump campaign and the Russians, and then now you have all these documents coming out, where do you think this path ends for him, and what about Michael Flynn?
Yeah, well, Jeff Sessions is in a really tough spot right now. He has the president upset at him for recusing from the Russia administration and for not taking on these kind of ridiculous Department of Justice attacks. And he has the issue about how it appears that he did not tell the truth about contacts that he had with Russia. So I think there's an issue there. Flynn, like Manafort, before he took the job in the campaign, was on the take from the Russian government and the Turkish authoritarian government. And then you have Jared Kushner, who I think obviously was at minimum doing business with Russia. Maybe has nothing related to the collusion, but again, another very high level, very close contact of somebody who has a financial stake with a hostile foreign government. It's unprecedented. I think Flynn and Kushner are probably the next people on the docket, maybe not for indictments, but for the folks to look at.
There's been some speculation that President Trump could pardon some or perhaps all of the people who are indicted, maybe even himself, if it ever comes to that, if he himself is indicted. Can he legally do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question is not whether he can do it legally. The question is whether that's prudent or not, whether that makes a lot of sense. I think most people agree that it would create a significant constitutional crisis were he to go forward and to pardon individuals like Paul Manafort. Look, Paul Manafort's a bad guy. I mean, if you look at what's in the indictment here, he's done some things that are clearly, in my mind, and directly a threat to the United States and to national security of the United States. So we need to be clear about this guy and who he is.
But the other day, asked by the White House press corps if he would consider a pardon of Manafort, he refused to answer. He did not rule that out. I think that's significant. And also significant is his own tweets, his own nervousness about the issue. It's publicly, it's out on public record how he's feeling about this, and the fact that it's looming. I think that is very significant.
You would think a politician with no issues about this would just very clearly say, anybody on my campaign that had inappropriate Russian actions, we will deal with that. And we hope that the law, executes.
But instead, a
fully, but he never does that.
A denigration of the FBI and the Justice Department in this publicly is unprecedented too. So when it comes to pardons,
but I think exercising the pardon power, were he to actually do that, I think it would be unprecedented. It would be a serious constitutional problem, and then I think you do end up in some really treacherous waters. And this administration already is in hot water, but that would take it to a boiling point.
Well, you have a Watergate situation at that point. A lot of questions arising. And I want to go back to something you said earlier before we wrap up this segment, this part of it, which is the whole Facebook, Google, and Twitter hearings. You said lawmakers long knew about this type of activity by foreign governments. When you step back and take a look at what was discussed during those two-day hearings, how did Silicon Valley companies come out of this looking?
I mean, I think they're right in the scope here. All of a sudden, people understand the role that they played. And now I think what you saw up there was the Senate wants to see the CEOs. It's not enough to have the lawyers there. Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook, and Facebook has particularly been in the light here in terms of their role. I don't think the legislators are done with them. I think the role needs to be continued to be examined because these are huge media companies. Everybody understands that now. And they're not going to get away with any more just sort of answers about.
I'd add that the tech companies obviously have a problem that they need to address. I think that they came, Facebook in particular, honestly, with tangible steps that they're doing to address it this week. What I want to know is what the government is doing about it. California Senator Dianne Feinstein, she railed against the tech companies saying, where were you? Why didn't you stop this Russian aggression? My question for her would be, where were you? Senator Feinstein was on the Intelligence Committee. President Obama had this intelligence in the summer and chose to sit on it. Those were choices that they made, and I think that it's incumbent upon the government to be the first line of defense against foreign actors interfering in our democracy. And if the intelligence community sees the problems, it was incumbent on them to go to the tech companies. So I think there's a little bit of typical Washington finger pointing. Not to say the tech companies don't have something that they need to address.
Well, the tech companies, though, did seem to be dragging their feet a little bit, right? I mean, Feinstein made her comment, but Senator Kamala Harris also, when she asked them how much money did you make off these ads and off these posts, they said, we don't know. We didn't do the analysis. I mean, doesn't it seem odd that they hadn't done that when they knew for months the hearings were going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that they have to be forthcoming, and as much as possible, they need to figure out what they could have done. There's no question about that. I think the flip side of this, though, is let's recognize this for what it is, which is this is not just about social media companies and Russia. This is about efforts of foreign states that are hostile to the United States, whether it's Russia or North Korea or Iran, potentially trying to undermine our system of democracy. And what are we, what are our representatives in Washington, what is the government doing to try and stop this? To Tim's point, to just think about this in the framework of what the social media companies have done, I think is way too limiting and opens us up to potential future attacks.
All right, let's talk taxes, because I want to make sure we touch on that before we run out of time. And Carla, Californians already rely heavily on the deductions, right, for state and local taxes. Those deductions would be eliminated under this GOP tax bill. How will this play out politically in California with the 2018 midterm elections?
This is the issue that we know that California is likely to be hammered, California and New York, because when you're talking about the mortgage deduction, for instance, 4 of the 6 top markets in the country that have where houses over $500,000 are sold are right here, including Marin County being the #1, San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara. So this is going to heavily hit the Bay Area, but also areas like Orange County, where you have a number of races here. Those 14 Republicans here in California have got to be sweating this in terms of how are they going to vote on this thing when people in their districts, state, as you said, state and local income tax deductions. This hits California more and New York more than any other state. And
elections have consequences. I don't think that Californians expected Donald Trump to put forth a tax reform plan that was going to be best for California. I do think the Senate is going to address some of this stuff. This isn't the final piece of legislation that will go forth, and I think you saw a lot of Republican senators flake Sass, Rubio this week expressing that there needed to be some changes, particularly to focus on the middle class. Some of that would address, I think, California. But I expect that this is something that's likely going to pass.
And Lanhee, well, what would it take for something like this to pass? I mean, who do they have? I mean, obviously they have to appeal to the middle class, right? But what's the message here that they need to get across?
Well, you know, the message comes back to the fact that the tax system needs to be reformed to make it simpler, to boost growth. I mean, these are all the things they're talking about.
But the economy is doing well. I mean, so what's the impetus for reform? It's more like a tax cut plan.
Well, I think there's a couple things. First of all, I think tax reform has traditionally been a bipartisan issue, actually. Both Democrats and Republicans have said, look, we need to figure out a way to simplify the tax code, to make it more growth-oriented, et cetera. The big thing, though, about where we are now in this point in history is the politics of this. You cannot get away from the politics of it. The Republicans in the Congress recognize that they need to get something done. They weren't able to get anything done on Obamacare, which was their signature item for the first 9 months of this year. And now if they don't get anything done on tax reform, we've got a midterm election cycle coming up where potentially the Republicans could have serious electoral consequences if they can't get something done. That, more than anything, will dictate where this thing goes.
Okay, a lot to watch. I'm getting tired heading into the holiday season.
We need a break from life.
Lanhee Chen with Hoover Institution, Carla Marinucci with Politico, and also Tim Miller with Definers Public Affairs. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's been 6 weeks since Hurricane Maria tore through Puerto Rico. Roughly 70% of the U.S. territory remains without power, and more than 2/3 of its roads are still closed. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, has been spearheading recovery efforts and signing up hundreds of thousands of people for disaster assistance. But some, including the mayor of San Juan, have criticized FEMA for not doing enough. Last month, the Registered Nurse Response Network answered the mayor's call for help by sending 50 volunteer nurses from 8 states to Puerto Rico. Over the course of 2 weeks, they distributed clean water, food, and medication to thousands of hurricane victims in dozens of communities. We're joined now by two of the nurses. With me in the studio, Sandy Adler-Killen, an emergency room nurse at Kaiser Permanente Richmond Medical Center. And via Skype is Randy Litton, an emergency room nurse at St. Joseph Hospital in Eureka. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Twee.
Thank you.
Sandy, you returned 2 weeks ago
Correct.
from your relief mission in Puerto Rico. What were the conditions you saw there?
Twee, it was devastation. Literally, it was like a war zone without bullets. People were desperate. People had no clean water, no food. We encountered individuals who had been injured during the hurricane, shoulder dislocations, had no ability to get, in terms of access, transportation, roads were closed. They had, if they were able to get to a location, x-rays were down. People were, as I said, were just desperate for basic supplies, basic needs, and of course medical care and medicine. They were out of medications.
And Randy, so you first arrived about 2 weeks after the hurricane hit, and these were the conditions you still saw. Were you actually the first responders that many of these people saw?
Oh yeah. I mean, just hearing Sandy talk is bringing me back to every single moment that we would go out to these villages, these towns, these barrios. I personally went out with 2 groups every day, and we would try and at least go to 2 different towns on the island. And there wasn't one town that I went to where they said, oh, aid has already actually been here. Every single town said the same thing. You're the first people that we've seen. And this was on day 22, day 23 while we were down there. They were just standing in line waiting for someone to show up to give them food, water, hope.
Yes.
And were you shocked that you were the first responders, Sandy?
I was absolutely amazed. You know, people grabbed us, held us, sobbed in our arms. We cried with them. Again, just having the ability to provide them with some basic necessities that we actually, Randy, amazingly, started a GoFundMe account, and it allowed us to purchase glucometer strips for blood sugars. People were, their sugars were even unreadable when we took them. People who had such high blood pressures, suffering from hypertension, out of their medications, just complete desperation, and so much gratitude that they weren't forgotten by us.
And Randy, why was it so important to you to go on this mission?
I live in Northern California, and I think it's only a matter of time before a disaster hits our area. I mean, while we were down there, we lost 2 of our nurses. They had to fly back because their homes were destroyed in the Santa Rosa fires. So it happens everywhere around the world, and it's our job to respond to those areas that are in need, because one day it's going to happen to us, and we're just going to hope and pray that people showed up like we showed up for them. I mean, to wait 25 days in the heat and in the pouring down rain and just hoping for a shrivel of food or water, I can't even imagine what that feels like.
Oh yeah, we encountered couples in their 80s that were living in homes filled with black mold, no roofs, no sides of the house, no food, no water. And to be a U.S. citizen and know these are my fellow citizens, and they had nowhere to go. Some were even told by FEMA, don't touch anything, live in this condition, because if you move anything, then you might not get reimbursed, and we won't be able to help you.
And speaking of FEMA, Randy, did you see a lot of FEMA workers when you were there?
I hate to even say this, but in the 2 weeks that I went into 2 to 3 towns a day, my 2 groups personally never saw FEMA in one town.
Never?
Not once.
And what did you think of that?
I couldn't wrap my mind around the disorganization and chaos that was happening. I still to this day can't understand why the aid wasn't there when they were saying that it was there. Why were these people not receiving aid? If we wouldn't have started that GoFundMe account, it is, I think, up to $55,000 now. That was the money that we were using to get food, to get water to these people, to get medications. If we wouldn't have started that fund, I don't know how we would have accessed as many communities as we did.
Yes.
So,
well, we did contact FEMA, and they gave us this statement about their recovery efforts in Puerto Rico, essentially saying the overall federal effort following Hurricane Maria has included the largest medical response mission ever. They said more than 4,700 medical personnel have treated more than 30,000 patients so far. They have also provided temporary power to the island's hospitals. But Sandy, what you're describing doesn't seem like that's what you witnessed on the ground.
I encountered FEMA one time while we were there. One day we had an assignment where they asked us to support and set up a triage station at a stadium where people were actually going to fill out paperwork to get support from FEMA. Well, people have been standing in line, Twee, from the previous afternoon in 90-degree heat, and some of them weren't even being processed until the next afternoon. And then after they filled out by hand their paperwork, they were given a juice box and a bag of chips.
Randy, what were the biggest health needs and concerns that you saw while you were there?
Well, besides we saw a lot of chronic issues, diabetes, hypertension, but we realized really fast that the bigger issue is something that isn't even at play yet. It's just beginning, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. The water issue in Puerto Rico right now is that it's contaminated. It's contaminated with a specific bacteria, leptospirosis. People are dying from it already, and until they get a good handle on the water system, until they start getting filtrations, more and more people we're going to see are going to be dying from this drinking of water because they're not even being given bottled water. And then the other health issue is the black mold. That's just all the homes are covered in it right now from all the still water that sat in those homes for 7-8 days. Now everybody's breathing in this black mold. So it's really going to honestly get worse before it gets better. But those are the two big epidemics that we're going to see take off.
Yeah. Well, my hat's off to both of you for being there to help out. So thank you to Randy Litton and also Sandy Adler-Killen for being here today. And if you would like more information on Randy Litton's GoFundMe page for this relief effort, you can go to gofundme.com/Hurricane Maria Nurse Relief. And that will do it for us. For more of our coverage, go to kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Twee Vu. Thank you for joining us.